Hi, everybody. My name is Bill Schlund, and I'll be going through a presentation on what's new in Creo 7 or Pro E version 35. This was released just about 11 months ago, and we'll go through. When I was going to focus on mostly the core capabilities that are inside of Creo 7, there are a lot of new modules and enhancements to extraneous modules that happened in the Creo 7 release, but since everybody I know has core capabilities, I thought I would focus on that, and that will give us the most bang for our buck. I do have a PowerPoint, so I'll be going through some things in the PowerPoint, highlighting ideas in 7, and then I'll be working in the software to kind of re-demonstrate those live for you. I'm real informal when I do these, so if you do have questions, do not hesitate to ask. But let's kind of start off. The first thing is augmented reality. Right now, that's not a huge thing, but in the future, the capabilities of being able to distribute the things that engineers and designers create to other people, maybe on their cell phone or with some other type of device, so that they can see the products that are being developed. That will be a need. Currently is a need, but the technology will allow that to be done real easily. It is now through augmented reality. And what PTC does with that is you can take any Creo model assembly and send it to the cloud, have it generate what they call an experience, and they can send that back then to you as a link, and you can send that to other people so they can use Vuforia to view that 3D model, spin it around. It can play animations, things like that. So that's really what augmented reality is. It's basically taking your product that was developed in Creo and then being able to have people access it in a super lightweight version and be able to manipulate it that way. But what they've changed in 7, because you've been able to do that for a few releases now, but they've added some things where you can do, there's support for combined states. So we have simplified reps, we have exploded views, we have different types of states that we can set our models up in. We can also combine those together. So some of the parts are maybe cross-sectioned, and we have simplified reps, so certain ones are turned off, and we can combine all these different representations together. It used to be called all, but now they're just called combined states, and we can publish those, right? So that gives you another degree of modification that you can, so you're just not getting the product all by itself, but maybe some cross sections or some exploded views better represent and are easier for people to digest certain aspects of it in those representations. So you can do that. So basically that's what they've added to the AR experience. So that was just a quick little thing, but we'll see a lot more of that, I'm sure, in the future as this technology evolves more and more. So one of the interesting things and kind of a big deal with Creo is that now when you create a new part, it is automatically set to absolute accuracy. Before, it's always been relative. I mean, ever since the very beginning. But as we've seen, usually when you start taking those components or assemblies and moving them into another application, whether it be into manufacturing or analysis or something else, what it basically does, Creo will make a copy of it and then move it into that product. And anytime you make a copy, it's an opportunity for things to go sideways. And so it's always better to usually use more or higher accuracy for that. And we've seen that in sheet metal where now when you create a sheet metal part, it makes it in absolute accuracy. If you try to send something into the mold design package, it automatically switches it to absolute accuracy. So these other applications are asking for absolute accuracy for them to do their work. So obviously down in the very beginning, we might as well make it so Creo does that. So now by default, if you create a model in Creo, it will create it with absolute accuracy. And you'll see an extension under the template. So in the load point where all the templates are, you'll see a .abs after it. That means it's a model or a start part or a start model with absolute accuracy. And there's still a .rel after that for relative. So you can still use relative accuracy, and there's no issues with that from the standpoint of being able to create a model. But one of the things any system administrator types out there might want to start thinking about is your start parts, start rebuilding those to using the absolute accuracy going forward, because That's the way it's going to be. Eventually I see this relative accuracy kind of fading away. There was a configuration, remember, in Creo, so you could turn on absolute accuracy. It was called, enable absolute accuracy or something like that. But that doesn't need to be around anymore. So that configuration option is gone in 7 because absolute accuracy is on all the time. And there's also something new in 7 called multibody design, but it's kind of recommended for doing multibody design because then you can start doing some Boolean subtractions and intersections and splitting and things like that, which require a little bit more accuracy than the relative accuracy we're used to using. There's something else talking about core modeling that the import data doctor now recognizes geometry in different ways than it used to. It used to, when you bring in something, so this is a screenshot that I did at Creo 6, and then over here in Creo 7, the same model. In 6, it said, okay, you got a couple of components. So there's 2 parts there in this step file, and then there's just a miscellaneous surface sitting out there. But what 7 does is it says, well, you have a body, a quilt, and a surface. So the body is an enclosed quilt that it can turn into a solid. The other one is kind of an open quilt, right? It's not closed, so it couldn't convert it. It wouldn't be able to convert it into a solid, unless you stitch some edges together or close some gaps or something like that. And then again, just the surface is sitting there. So it can recognize different bodies inside a single step file. And again, some of the competitive softwares out there do multi-body design, so it can pick up on the internal multiple bodies in a part file, for instance. There's also some display things that have been added, and it's a way of kind of making things transparent based on the type of geometry it is. So if you have solid or surface geometry, that would be considered a boundary or B-rep, right? Boundary representation. And we can kind of turn those more transparent or less with this little slider bar that we see here. And then anything that isn't solid or a surface model can be or at least changed from its transparency based on that type. And really the only 2 things I can kind of think of that fall in that mixed area would be maybe the lattice that you would create if you're going to create a part that you're going to send to a 3D printer. And then the other one would be an STL file, right? Something like that, a tessellated file. So those would really be the 2 instances. Something that I noticed that was kind of impervious to either one of these were curves. If I had a sketch that was sitting out there or I had a datum curve, neither one of these affect that. It would still be fully displayed. But anyway, there's some improvements in the Sketcher. Sketcher's been changing a fair amount over the last few releases, again, making it easier to use. But one of the things that has been added now, in the past, when we do a mirror, we'd always put a center line in there and we'd mirror about that. Now you can mirror about any straight line that's in your sketch. So you no longer are constrained to have to use a center line to mirror things about. And also we'll see that the behavior in my example of how things behave with that center line can be a little bit different depending on if we lock it or not. But we'll talk about that in a second or two. One of the other things which is kind of nice in the Sketcher is that if we have the constraints displayed there, I can mouse over one of the constraints. In this particular case, this line that's highlighted in red was mirrored over to this side. If I put my mouse on that mirror constraint, it will highlight both of those lines because they're mirrored. And then it also highlights in red the center line, in this case, that they were mirrored about. If I do, 2 lines are equal, if I put my mouse over the equal sign, the other corresponding lines or entities that are of equal length will highlight as well. So there's kind of visual feedback of the constraints, not just the icon itself, but if you put your mouse over that icon, it will highlight the geometry that it's really constraining at that point, which is kind of nice. And then kind of speaking of sketches, one of the things that we can do is that usually when we go and edit the sketch, obviously the dimensions for that sketch appear, but we can also now include the Sketcher constraints. So sometimes that can be useful to you when you're looking at this sketch and maybe it wasn't your part or somebody else's, and you can kind of see, oh, this is supposed to be a horizontal line, or this one is equal length to this line, or something along those lines. So we can see those little icons displayed when we say, edit sketch. or not edit sketch, but actually modify, dimension. And also those icons, this is good for me because a lot of times I need my reading glasses when I'm doing this. You can make them bigger or smaller. And then this is just under display settings, under options in the setup. So let's kind of look at some of this. And I'm going to bring out a couple other things that I noticed in Creo, which are kind of interesting as well. So let's call up a part here. Now I'm going to start out, I'm going to make a part from scratch just so I can show you something. So I'm going to say, let's create a part. I'm not going to use the default template just so we can see the templates that are out there. And you can see how it's grabbing inches, part, solid, ABS. And there's also a relative one, right? Accuracy. But by default, it grabs the ABS guy. So that's good. So now we're set with absolute accuracy. One of the things I'm going to do here is I'll say, let's go in and let's kind of create an extrusion on this plane. And I'll just do, I don't know, I'll just do a rectangle, something simple. Let's do this guy. So I've got kind of a shape here. Okay, take a look at this. If I change this, make it a little bit smaller, we could say 6 by maybe 4. So here's our sketch. As soon as I extrude this, here's another thing. This started in 6. It's now in 7 as well. But if you're one of those companies that kind of leapfrogs from major release to major release, so if you're coming from 4 or 5 or something like that, watch when I extrude this out. Now, typically in Creo, when it extrudes out something, it would make it like 216 or something like that, some obnoxious number. What it does now is that it looks at the geometry that you sketched, the size of the geometry you sketched there, and then extrudes it out relative to that. So instead of it extruding out to 200, it says, well, you got something that's 6 by 4, so 5 is probably a good number to kind of use as a guess for your initial extrude. So from that aspect, it makes things a little bit easier. Now there's something else that I wanted to highlight as well, is if I wanted to do mask properties. So I just made a block here. And mask properties have changed a little bit in 7 as well. So I'm going to go over here, I'm going to say mask props. And we can see our menu pop up here. You notice there's a little triangle here saying missing, and I can't calculate mask props. So back, I think in the day, it would just put in a value of 1 or something like that. And you'd have it like a shoebox that would weigh like 1,000 pounds or something like that. So one of the things that PTC has done now is they put in this default material, and it's called PTC System Material Properties. It's kind of the default one, but it won't, if it's there, it won't run mass properties. So you could have a whole assembly, everything's assigned a material except for one part. If you go to run mass properties, it'll go, nope, can't do it because this one part doesn't have material assigned to it. So that's where you go in and you say assign material. And here we can see the name of it, PTC System Material Property. And I'm going to say other. And then this is where I can go and grab some materials. So I could say, let's make it aluminum. So here's the default one. You can't delete this guy. That's the first thing I saw. I said, well, maybe I want to edit it and put in my own properties. Maybe I just want to delete it. You can't. You got to just add properties to it. So the first property you add obviously is going to be the one that it's going to use. And when I say, okay, we'll add him in there. Now when I say, okay, now I can run the mask properties. So, and one of the things that you can do, if you're having assembly and the mask properties aren't running, you can come over here to like columns. And under the very last guy right here, I drag down, is called PTC Reported Materials. And I can pick on this and move them over, add them to the column. And if I say apply, it would be here, and you can see that aluminum is applied here. But if I had this huge assembly and there was a part missing a material, we could just look through all the parts. They'd all have assignments except for that one, or maybe a couple of them. But it's just a way of kind of finding, the needle in the haystack, maybe another way of doing that. So just a couple of extraneous things that I've kind of come across working with Creo 7 that hopefully you won't be bumping your head on it as I did. So let's talk a little bit about the sketching, because I mentioned that a little bit earlier on. So let's just say creating a sketch on this face, and we'll start with that. So the first thing I want to do is I'm going to say, let's start creating a line. And you'll notice we have, our assumed, front plane and right plane. So it snaps to those. And then it'll also snap to geometry and then geometry back here. And I think this is Creo 4 that was doing things like that. And it was kind of cool. But if you were in an assembly and there are lots of parts behind that, it'd be snapping like crazy to all these parts because it sees everything behind there. And so that was kind of a, first thing people do is I'm turning that off. That's, it's just irritating. It's snapping to too many things and I want to have more control over it. So one of the things that's been added here in 7 is right here is called snap settings. So first of all, I could say, turn it off so you don't ever snap to geometry. But then this one is important. So that's what they used to do, right? It was just either an on or an off switch, right? But now there's this other thing called instant snapping. So I'm going to turn that off. So now if I go in, so instant snapping is turned off. It'll still snap to these guys, but you'll notice it doesn't snap to these outside lines unless I sit on them for a second, then it will. So now I can be a little more judicious on what I'm going to, if I wanted to snap to this back line, I just kind of sniff around for it and then it will find it. But it's not just snapping crazily to anything that it finds. You have to kind of sit on it for about a second and then it finds it. So that's that option, which is under snapping, right mouse button. It's just this guy. Usually if you turn him off, then you have a little bit more control over where it's snapping to. I'll also show you one other thing, and let's turn instant snapping on, right? Because that's the irritating one. So it's going to snap to everything. One thing that I found is we're looking right here at our sketching plane, but if I tilt it just a little bit like that, and now I say I want to start sketching a line, it'll snap to the edges that it sees, but it doesn't snap to anything else. It'll snap to the references, right? And it'll tell me when it's horizontal or vertical, but it doesn't snap to anything else, even though instant snapping is on, because everything's off just a little bit. But then this might be a disturbing thing to you. I don't want my sketch plane to be, a little bit tilted. It's, going to screw up my life. So one of the things that we can do to kind of compensate for that is I'm looking straight at it, squared up right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on perspective. All right. So now, same type of thing. So if I go in, I start sketching a line, I can still snap to outside stuff, but the inside stuff it doesn't see, right? Just because it's kind of perspective view. It's kind of screwing it up, the sketcher up enough so it won't snap to things. So you can either turn off that instant snapping and kind of hesitate and then it will snap to things, or you can just kind of tilt your sketch in one way or another. And that's just kind of another way of doing that. But one of the other things I mentioned, obviously, was that we can mirror about linear geometry. So I'll put in a circle, right? So here's our circle. And let's switch this maybe a little bit easier for everyone to see if it's in wireframe like this. Then let's put in a line, right? So I'll just say, let's just make some kind of line that's, I don't know, like this. So now I have a line created. I'm going to pick on this guy. And I can say, let's mirror it about this line. So far, everything looks great. I can go over and grab this, make it bigger, make it smaller, all those types of things. One of the other things I was talking about is see how the little equal sign, if I put it, if I go over and put my mouse on the equal sign, I'm not even clicking on it. You notice that they both highlight. And then this says they're mirrored. So if I put my mouse over that icon, it says it highlights not only both entities that were mirrored, but what they were mirrored about. Since we can mirror it about straight lines now, we probably want to highlight that line because we could have a bunch of lines in our sketch. It might be kind of hard to tell exactly which one. Now here's some interesting behavior. I'm going to take either one, doesn't really matter. You know what, right? I can make one bigger or smaller. But if I start moving them around, watch what happens. The center line moves around. So the center line stays between these two. So the closer I get them, the closer the center line is to either one. Or if I move them apart, it moves apart. And I can even kind of rotate them, right? So what it's doing, this type of behavior, is that the center line remains halfway between these two guys. And if we move them, the center line moves, which is kind of a different behavior. We're not used to seeing that. I don't know the big advantages of that yet, but that's one of the things that it can do. What I can do also is just click on this and say lock this. So now he's locked. So if I take my guy here, and I start moving him around, now it behaves like it always has, right? So one of the things to be mindful of is that we can lock. You notice if I put my mouse over it, we have the little lock symbol there, meaning that now it's locked and this guy doesn't move, right? And now it behaves like it always has. If it's not locked, then he is movable and he will stay, halfway between the two entities that were mirrored about him. So kind of an interesting concept in the sketcher, but I just kind of wanted to highlight that for you. We'll cancel out of this. Yeah, I don't think there's anything else I want to do here in the sketcher. Let's turn this guy around a little bit. One of the other things that I mentioned is if I go in here and I want to modify some dimensions, obviously the dimensions pop up. I really like this feature that they added, putting kind of a little white box around the geometry, or around the dimension, I guess I should say, that's in front of the geometry. It makes it a little bit easier to read it, especially when the geometry is kind of darker like this. But you'll notice that we see just the dimensions here. And one of the things I mentioned before is that there's an option to turn on those guys, the constraints. So it's under options. And what I did, it's in my config option, but I put it under favorites. And it's just called show sketcher constraints dynamic edit. So when I'm dynamically editing a sketch, show the constraints. So I'm going to click that on. You'll notice that up here, I have the use pre-Creo 4 constraints, because those used to be bigger, easier for me to see. They were the old school ones, but they're just easier for me to see. The other ones are just too little. It was just kind of tough. But now, there's a little dragger handle for those. In fact, under entity display, if we go down to the bottom, here's where we can drag it, make them bigger. So right now I have it maybe 40% as big as what they could be. But that's just under entity type down near the bottom here. We can set that. So we'll say okay. And I won't save it to my config, but we'll be using it now. And now if I go in here and say I want to edit this, we'll notice that the constraints come up as well as the dimensions. So we can see if lines are horizontal, or this one says they're collinear, this one says it's vertical, or all those types of things. So it gives me a little more insight into that sketch if that is something that I need to know. So with that, let's go back to our PowerPoint here. And we kind of left off right there anyway. So, and here is that under entity, display entity, we can see where we can make our icons. You can make them really, if you drag it way to the right, they're just obnoxiously big. But, somewhere where I had it or over here, they're pretty good. I still wear my readers, but that's the way it is. Also, we have core modeling capabilities with the draft feature. So what the draft feature does is, in regular Creo, you can actually add draft to draft. And I think draft on top of draft, you could do that. But in imported geometry, if there's draft on that geometry, it will recognize it as draft and allow you to make modifications to it. So let's look at a real quick example of that. We'll call up this part. So here's the part that we were looking at. And one of the things, that I have over here, I have a lattice structure, right, that I was talking about before. So if we go over here and I'll lower my screen a little bit here. If we go under view, this is where we can kind of display things. Remember before it was B reps and mixed. In the mixed stuff, I can kind of grab this and kind of fade it out and fade it back. Now I'll show you something that's make you scratch your head a little bit. So I have this part here and I say, let's fade him out. He's not fading out. And it's like, well, why the heck? You just told me that it was supposed to fade out. It's because he has a color. It's not fading out. If I remove the color, I can fade him out. It's sort of like the Invisible Man. If you put a bunch of makeup on him, and he turns invisible, you just see the makeup. That's kind of what it's doing here. It's a really bad analogy, sorry. But the thing is that we made him a different color other than the default color. So if I went back to here and said, let's clear the appearance for this body. And now it's gray. Now if I come back here, so this is kind of a pain because you don't want to always use that default gray color. But notice now that he doesn't have a color assigned to him, just the default color. So this only seems to appear or work with the default color that Creo has. So kind of I don't know, I consider it kind of a shortcoming, but So put the color back on here for a minute. So this is an import part, right? So other than just that extrude and the lattice stuff, it's just one big giant import feature. And one of the things I was mentioning is that we can work with draft. So I want to show you something that's kind of interesting. We're going to say draft, and I'm going to pick on this guy. Just pick on like one of these surfaces, and there is a little bit of draft on there. You can see that. So if I pick on him, and I could say, you know, on the draft hinge is this bottom face, it grabs that and it says that draft, and it highlights it all in orange, right? That's the drafted surfaces, and it's highlighting the rounds on top in green. So basically saying if you're going to change the draft, you know, you can change it and then I'll reapply the rounds after that. But we can see that draft. And so now I can say, let's just change that, you know, maybe change it to like 8 degrees. So we've increased the draft a little bit. You saw it kind of move in a little bit there. And it's created a draft feature. So really what it's done is it's kind of hijacked this geometry and turned it into a draft feature, which I think is kind of cool. That's kind of what you want Creo to do when you got this dumb geometry, is at least grab the stuff you know and turn it into something that Creo can use. And the same would be true for this guy that we see right here. If we wanted to go in and say, you know, I want to add draft onto this guy, and we could say maybe the draft hinge is like this top face, it's going to go and highlight. Now this one is like a cone. It by default, you know, cones have draft on them, so do pyramids and everything else. So even if features, if they're those types that, you know, automatically have built-in draft, it still recognizes it, right? Anything that's not vertical, it recognizes that draft. And you notice here, there's all kinds of rounds and things that it's going to have to adjust to if we want to change the draft on that. But it's really kind of a nice feature. Now there's another little thing that we can look at here. If we look at this boss that's kind of sticking up, this surface here has draft on it, about 10 degrees. This back surface right here has no draft on it, it's vertical. And then this front one up here, it's about 35 degrees. So I'm going to pick this guy, and I'm going to hold my control button down and pick this guy. So those two both have the same draft. And I know this because I looked at it earlier. But I'm going to go into my draft feature. I'm going to say, oh, it still wants me to pick these guys. Pick that one. Oh, preferences. And we'll remove this guy. And our reference will be the other side, this guy. And the draft hinge will be this guy. I don't know why it's fighting me on this. All right, I'm going to remove everybody out of here. Okay, draft surface is that guy, those two. Yep. Draft hinge is there. All right, geez. So, so we have those two surfaces, and it's saying I found this, and it's 10 degrees, right? Like I told you. Now I want to add something to this. So I can come over here and say under draft surfaces. So it's really what it's telling me is that I found 10 degrees draft on both these guys. I'm going to say under draft surfaces, let's add this guy. Look what it does. It puts it to 0, but it was just telling me it was 10 a minute ago. So when it has different surfaces that have different draft, it goes, I don't know what to do with it. I'm going to make them all 0. And then now you put in the draft that you want to control all these guys with. So let's remove that last guy. So this time I just have those two organized or picked as 10 degrees, but this time I'm going to type in 10. So instead of Creo telling me it found 10, I'm going to say make it 10, even though it's the same number. By doing that, if I go in and say add another surface, it makes him at 10, right? Because I'm saying now by typing in that value, anything I pick, I want to be at 10 degrees draft. And I can go back to this back surface over here and include him. and he goes in at 10 degrees as well. So it's a difference between if it tells you something and you pick multiple drafted surfaces, it's going to reset them all and then have you put in a driving surface. If you, the minute it says, I found this amount of draft, and you type in that same number or a different number, any other surfaces that you pick will be driven to that number that you've typed in because you have changed what it found. So just a kind of a nuance that I found with this. I had to think about it a little bit to figure out what it was doing, but that is what it's doing. So let's go back to our PowerPoint here. The Freestyle feature, right? A single feature that allows us to create more complex kind of organic type shapes using subdivisional modeling. That's been, capabilities have been getting more and more evolved with this. Even the interface has changed from the original interface, had this little dial wheel that you could pick commands on. I always kind of liked that. But now it has, just regular kind of pop-up windows that we're used to seeing elsewhere in Creo. And before we could take this geometry and we could snap it to a datum curve or something so we could control it. Our datum curves we can control mathematically, and so we can have a little bit more control over where this subdivisional body is, because usually it's more kind of push and pull type thing. But now with 7, the thing that they said is if it's along an edge, you can say I want to apply draft along that edge. By default, it assumes that it'll be 10 degrees draft, but you can go between plus and minus 90, but we can actually apply draft along a curve now, given like a pull direction. And, so it's good for making plastic parts if we're using, subdivisional modeling or this Freestyle feature. So that was something new that was added in Creo 7. So sheet metal, there's really just one thing that's in there that is kind of more interesting than not. And it's the ability, if we're using a sketched form, that it kind of, before when we flatten it out, it kind of leave a little wavy surface. That is if the form kind of was part on the flat surface and part kind of over, was kind of over the edge of that. Let me just show you a real quick example, and then we can kind of take a look at that. So let's say I'm going to create a new part. I'll say it's a sheet metal part. So I have this set up so that it just creates a kind of a dummy sheet metal first feature for me. And I'm just going to go under forms and say, let's create a sketched form. And I just pick on a surface and it brings me in and says, okay, what do you want to sketch to be the shape of my form? And I'll say, let's just put, this guy on here, maybe like that. So now Creo takes that, kind of extends it up, and we can bring it up a little bit more. And then over here under options, I could say, let's add some rounds on the top and on the bottom, and maybe add some taper onto that, maybe like 15 degrees, something like that. And so now we've got our form feature. And if we kind of look at, if we look at the edges, you can kind of see that they're a little, and it just has to do with the way that Creo works. It's kind of doing an offset surface on this to create the form feature. But the thing is that if we go in and look at it in the flattened out version, we can see that kind of waviness right there, right? So one of the things that we can do is we can take that feature and take, kind of take advantage of what, let's redefine this guy under options and use that new option here for trimming the edges. So let's kind of look at this edge right here. So we can kind of see how it kind of bows out and has this. Watch when I click this. I'm going to click it right now. It just trims it right back, right? So it's nice and flat. So obviously if it's flat here, when we flatten it out, and we take a look at it at our flat pattern, it's now a nice straight line along there. So that was kind of it for sheet metal, not earth-shattering really. Weld has changed, and with the weld feature, and I won't go through an example of this, but before, if it wasn't exactly a straight right angle, using solid welds, it would kind of leave a little gap there. Now a 7, it kind of extends things out. You weren't able to do this before in Creo 6, but now you can in 7, where it can go around the corner and go between parts, kind of fill in the gap. You could do a surface in 6 with this, but you know, if we want to do a solid, it wouldn't, and surfaces wouldn't even look like this. It'd just be a surface here and over there, and they wouldn't be connected along the edge. Here, it makes a nice clean edge. It just represents the weld a little bit better. So that's how they changed the weld, just basically in corners, making it be a little bit more robust. So the Render Studio, you know, uses KeyShot now. If we, and Mannequin is part of the, you know, the core offering design essentials that PTC is offering right now. But in the Mannequin, you could always look through his eyes and see what he saw. And that was really useful. You know, can he see all the dials? Can he see a kid in front of the car? You know, that kind of thing. But now you can actually shade photorealistic rendering of what he sees. So that might be good for kind of marketing, or, you know, maybe for engineering to see, you know, if, you know, how clear things are. Another thing that was added is that by default, you know, KeyShot would just put your part on the floor, and then it would shade it. So you'd have reflections like you see in this guy down here. Now there's the option, you just can go under the environment and settings and just say the floor, you know, I can pick another plane to be the floor, or I can offset the floor. But basically what it can do is make your part look like it's floating in space and not necessarily sitting on top of something. And maybe the reason you're doing that is maybe you're kind of making a parts catalog or something. You just want the image of the part there, and you don't need to have it sitting on a table or anything like that. It's, the focus is really the part itself. So that's just another thing that you can do just to lower that that floor, or get rid of it, so your part's just kind of sitting there in space. So this is big. Multi-body design. Huge way of changing the way that Creo behaves. What it allows us to do is create multiple bodies in the same part. So they're sort of like little mini parts. You're almost making an assembly in a way. But each of these are independent. You can apply different parameters to them, different mass properties, different colors, all of that. We could always kind of do that before, but you'd use quilts. You'd use a bunch of separate quilts, and then you could subtract one from the other, or cut one out from the other, and all that kind of stuff. But it was more features, and it's kind of complex. This is more along the lines of, you know, what a real multi-body modeler would be. And you can use it in a number of different ways. Here's an example of a mold. And we're, you know, using, here's like the cooling lines, let's say. We can use the, you know, create this as a sweep and use it as a body. You know, that's one body, and then the whole mold is the other body, and we can subtract one from the other and still keep the cooling line there, or just get rid of it and use it as kind of a tool to cut away things. Same with this example that we have right here. You know, this green area is really just the lattice work. So we're going to make a 3D printed part. We want some of it to be solid, but this part we wanted to have a lattice structure. Well, what we can do is have the different bodies, have the different areas be different bodies in this particular example. And then here we're using, you know, instead of just creating a sketch and patterning it and then saying, you know, use it as a cut, these are actually extrusions, a bunch of extrusions. And you can actually categorize these bodies as a construction feature. So it's a body, it has, you know, Creo recognizes it as a separate body, but because it's a construction body, it won't show up in a bill of material, right? It's sort of like a skeleton part in a way. You know, it's used to construct the main stuff, so we don't need it to be included with the main stuff. And I thought this is kind of an interesting example. Here we have an imported part. We split it down the middle. So now we have 2 parts. Then we took one of those parts and split it again. So now we have 3 parts. And then we just took it and tilted it. And then we can just use heal, and we can heal them all back together, and we'll have one single part again. It's just that one of these guys will be kind of cocked off at an angle. So the reason you want to use multi-bodies, you know, there's probably a lot of reasons why. But sometimes you might get, when you're developing an idea, you know, you develop this kind of shape. This is what we want our thing to be. But then as designers and engineers, we need to divide it up into pieces. You know, how many pieces is this thing going to be? That's where multi-body comes in. We can take this big design that someone came up and start hacking it up into the pieces that will eventually become the parts. So it's sort of like working kind of top down in reverse, where we're just kind of cutting up the pieces or cutting up the main body to make the individual components. So let's go through an example so you can kind of see, instead of me just talking about multi-bodies, we can kind of work with it. So I'm going to turn off our planes here. I have 2 sketches. That's all we have right here, just our planes and we have a sketch here on the bottom, and we have a sketch here kind of vertically like that. And we'll kind of work through this. I'm going to use, and I think this is a Creo 5 thing, sketch regions, but I'm going to say, let's grab this region and this region, and we're going to extrude it. And we'll say, let's extrude it down, maybe like this. And I'll say, okay. So you can see we've got our sketches and we've got an extrude. The only thing that's different with Multibody is in the tree, it says that there's one body. And I can expand this down. It says you got body number 1 there. I don't have to use Multibody, right? I can just keep using Creo as the way I always have. The only thing I'll notice different is that there'll be this little icon here in our model tree saying that there are bodies there. And if I don't do anything, there'll only be one body, right? Just creates one. So now let's kind of expand this guy out for a second. I'm going to pick on this one. I'm going to say, extrude him out. In this case, I can say, let's have him kind of remove some material. And we'll say, okay. So now this body 1 is if I kind of open them up. Oh, doesn't let me open them up yet. It's 2 extrusions. All right. So we'll see that in a second. So now I have some other areas over here. So I'm going to grab these and say, let's extrude those out. So now we've got another extrusion. Now, typical in Creo fashion, is that we could say, okay, this will be, we're making kind of a bracket, and it would automatically add these geometries together, right? And we have one continuous bracket. So a lot of the features have this body option in it. When we create something, we sweep it, we extrude it, we do something like that to it, we can say, make a new body. So right now it just says there's one body, but I could say, create this as a separate part, and not a PRT part, but as a separate body, I guess I should say. So I do that, and I'll say, okay. So now you'll notice it says there are 2 bodies here. There's body 2, which is this guy, and body 1. The interesting thing is, look at body 2 has a little star next to him, just like in assembly mode. The active part has the little star next to it. Well, here in Multibody, the active body has a star next to it. So if I create any other geometry, by default, it'll get attached to body 2. If I want to go to body 1 and say, make him the active one, now he's the active one. So it's exactly what we're used to seeing in assembly mode, but it's doing it with these individual bodies. So let's go over and real quickly just kind of take some geometry here, and I'll say, let's extrude that out, and we'll flip the direction. Don't remove. I'll drag it back here. I could actually make this a 3rd body if I wanted to, but because he's the active one, body 2, and I really do want to add it to him, I just leave it at that. And it automatically attaches him to body 2. So if we stand out, you see body 2 is made up of those 2 extrusions, and then body 1 is made up of these 2. So there's some things that I can do with this. For instance, I can go into view, and I could say, let's make yellow body 2. Or let's make green body 1. Right. So 1, 2. I can make them different colors. Now another thing I can do, I'm going to do something interesting here. I'm going to go up here to the top of the part, the main part. I'm going to say edit materials. So here's that default material, and I'm going to do and add some other materials to this just at the top level. So I'll add aluminum, we'll add brass, and we'll add steel. So you have different materials assigned at the top. Now, by default, everything will be aluminum because that was the first one I put in there. But I can go over to body 1, and I can come over here and say assign materials, and here's a list of the different materials that I've added. I can go and get some other ones, but I'll say, let's make that one steel. So now I have steel and aluminum, 2 different part bodies with 2 different materials. I can put different parameters in them. I can do all of that type of stuff. So I have kind of 2 bodies sitting here. Let's try doing something. I'm going to say, let's put in a round. So we'll say add a round, and we'll say maybe a radius of 1, and we'll put it on this body and on this one, and then over here, and over here. Oh, there. All right. So now we've got this round put in, and we can see that when I say okay, it adds it right here. Here's our round feature, as we would expect, right? Here are all the features we've been adding, but it also added a round to body 1 because the round touches him, and it adds a round to body 2. So they have their own little baby model trees representing what influences them. Now, I know one of the first questions comes out, can I put a round between this yellow part and this green part? And you can't. They're two different parts, and it doesn't know how to attach it or if it should attach it or anything like that. So as long as it stays kind of with the body, you can add those kinds of features, but going between bodies, not so much. So I have this set up. Something else I could do is say, let's create a cross section, and we'll say, let's make a plane cut through this. Let's say make a plane that goes through this and maybe parallel to that. So I'm just making one that goes right through the hole here. And we'll say, okay, I can preview that. There's our cross section, and I'm just going to call it like cross section A. So now we have a cross section through our two bodies. You notice it cuts them both at the same time, and I can cut one or the other. So all the different modules that are out there recognize and can work with multiple bodies. They understand that. So if you have a sheet metal part and it has kind of a press fit of some other material in there, that's just another body. Think of it that way. And you can create that body in that sheet metal part. So it's kind of interesting how that works. So here's our part. Let's make a drawing real quickly of it, and then maybe we can get close to drawing this to a close. I'm going to say let's make a drawing. And I won't do anything fancy. I'll just say like a default drawing, use a default template, C size, all that good stuff. We'll make it a little bit bigger. We'll go over to this view and change it to a section view, because remember I made that section cut before. So I'll say let's add section A and put the arrows in over here. So now we can see the cross section of the two parts. If I want to, I can pick on the cross hatching, kind of double click on it, and it says there's body stuff here. Look at that. So I can go for the body. I could say, and it's highlighting this one in green. We could say, let's change, I don't know, the angle, and make it like 30 degrees. And then we can go to the next body, which is this one. And maybe we can say, let's, I don't know, let's retrieve some kind of ceramic, let's say, and apply that there. And I can apply a color and all of that. But so now we have different cross hatchings for this. I can still, though, go in here under annotate and say, show me some dimensions of this. And it pops up those dimensions. Or, in the view up here, I could say, show me dimensions for that sketch. So it's basically the sketch right here. But I'll say, yeah, let's grab those guys too. So the dimensions are all there. Something else that's kind of interesting, I'm going to come over to tables. So we could always, make a table for a part, but we can never do a bill of materials for a part because it's just a part. This is still a PRT file. .prt just has two bodies in it. So under tables, that's another thing that knows about multiple bodies right here, body description. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to place one right here. So what it says is you have body 1, body 2, one's steel, one's aluminum, and it's picking up on those. I can't balloon it. Balloons still tie themselves to parts and not bodies. I have a feeling that will change, but right now you can't create balloon. You can create your own balloon and do that out, but as soon as I saw item 1, item 2, I go, wow, I should be able to use balloons for it. It's like, no, you can't. But one of the other things, let's go back to our part here for a second, is I'm going to go over here and say, let's extrude from this face here. And we'll grab some edges, I guess. So we'll say grab these guys. So that'll be our extrusion. And I'll say, let's extrude him out. And we could say symmetric. Well, won't give it a value. Just kind of drag it. So here I'm making another, it could be another part, right? Under bodies, I could say I wanted to attach to yellow guy. I could even say attach it to the green guy, right? And they're disjoint. They aren't touching each other, but they're both considered part of the same body. But in this case, I'm going to make him independent. Let's make him body number 3. So he comes in that great gray color that Creo has. But the thing is if I go back now and take a look at the drawing, you notice that body number 3 has been added. And he's taking on aluminum. The reason being is that that was the first thing in our list, but we can go back there, right mouse button on him and change that to, one of the other options that we had in there. But you can see he shows up, it's added to this little bill of material. So what it uses here is like body member name. It's always assembly member feature. Well, this, if we go over to tables, I think we'll be able to see that, what it calls it. But let's just say, switch this. Yeah. Model body name. So that's what that parameter is called. And then there's model body material and things like that. But anyway, so that is what is kind of new. Now there's something else I wanted to just touch on real quickly is detailing. We covered a lot of this. Here's a table that's using multi-bodies. So tables understand all of that. There's something new that was been added is sort of like a view summary. So if we go back to our drawing that we had here, I can pick on a view and I can right mouse button and say summary for the view. And it tells me about this view. So before there was view and info and it pop up a big window with a bunch of stuff in it. But this one tells me what kind of view it is. If it's related to another view, what scale it's at, is it a representation or not? So it's showing me different things about a view. You can actually use this as a mouse tip. If I put my mouse over a view, I can have that same information pop up if I want. That's also a, I think it's a detail or a config option to do that. But I don't want big things popping up when I put my mouse over something. So I like to control it with a right mouse button like that.
Bill, we probably should watch our time. I've got 12:56.
We'll pull the plug at this point because that's really as far as I wanted to run with this right now. That is all the areas that I wanted to cover. But yeah, I am open for questions if anybody has anything.
In the chat, if you can see them.
Oh, I don't see the
Okay,
chat.
let me see here. One was, can you undo the two bodies to make them one?
You can add them together. You can just go and redefine body X and change it back to body 1 or whatever body you want. That's how you would do it.
Can you assign a different number to each body?
Oh, Deb, you're fading.
Oh, sorry, I got to look at the laptop. Can you assign a different number to each body?
Well, yeah, you can call them whatever you want if that's what you mean, because by default it's calling it body 1, body 2. You can call it, bracket 1 and back bracket. You can call them whatever you want. I was just taking the default names.
Okay, that was the only 2 questions. If anybody, I got 12:57. If anybody else wants to shout out and ask a question.
I'll touch on one thing that it's kind of along those lines. So this is all in one PRT file. But as I mentioned, the reason we might want to cut this up into pieces is because we want separate parts. At some future point, we want this to be an assembly. And it's not one now, it's a part. So I can right click on this and I can say create part from body. So it goes and says, what do you want to call this part? And I could say, it's XXX. And here's the common name. And then it goes and creates a part from that. It uses copy geom to do that. So the downside of this is there's no dimensions. It will follow the original assembly, but if I say show dims in this guy, it's not going to happen. The first thing that when I saw this, I wrote the product line manager and I said, at least use an inherited feature where it copies all the features into it. But they didn't do that. So I'm waiting to see what's going to become of that, because we can show the dimensions when it's in a part, but as soon as we extract it, it uses this as a copy geom, and then there's no dimensions. Sorry, didn't mean to drift, but I wanted to highlight that.
See one more on the chat. Can you move the line once you've used it to mirror?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, you can lock it, you can unlock it, you can drive it by a dimension if you wanted to, anything like that. Yes. And remember, if it's not locked, if you move it, then the things that were mirrored about that line are going to move as well.